I'd like to introduce my sister-in-arms, Ms. Raina Hieroms, who will be presenting our first paper for this session. Ms. Hieroms, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jason. Good afternoon, everyone. As Jason mentioned, my name is Raina Hieroms. I'm an economic analyst and research specialist at the CBCS. So it's an honor for me to be presenting my working paper here at the 56th Annual Monetary Studies. So let's start. I will be presenting my paper named The Economic Implications of the Size of the Government, which is an analysis of 10 Caribbean countries covering a 20-year period of 2001 until 2020. As several of us mentioned, the disclaimer of this presentation is also that the views expressed in the presentation, also the paper, if you get a chance to read it, is my view and not especially of the central bank. Before we start, I will show the overview of the presentation. I will start with a short introduction. Then I will elaborate a little bit about literature findings that coincide with my working paper. Then I will introduce the data and the methodology. And then I will give the empirical results that I found. And then I will provide a short conclusion and some policy recommendations. Yes, everybody knows the role of government. It is very important. It's important because it provides certain goods and services. It provides basic needs for the community that, for example, the private sector is not willing to provide or is unable to provide because of the excessive financial burden. Think about upholding the law, about constructing the infrastructure, about maintaining the infrastructure, about providing social benefits to the community. Over the past decades, the level of spending of the government has been critically scrutinized, so there's a lot of literature analyzing the level of government spending. When we go way back to Wagner's law, we see that Wagner's law of increasing state spending states that government spending should foster the way for economic development. This means that government consumption or government investment should be the main drivers of economic growth. According to literature, there are several ways of measuring a government size. There are ways measuring it on the expenditure side of the government and also on the revenue side of the government. When we measure them on the expenditure side of the government, we use total current expenditure, and also we use consumption, that is a decomposition of the total current expenditure. When we measure it on the revenue side, we use the total revenues of the government, and also we use the total tax revenues of the government. Now, some literature findings. According to the work of Landau and Barro, the relationship between a government size and economic growth is negative because government operations tend to be done in an inefficient way. Also, certain fiscal policies tend to alter economic decision, and this economic decision distorts the productivity of the economy. Furthermore, they mention that extra spending of the government oftentimes go hand in hand with extra taxes. When you increase the taxes via increased tax rates, this may distort market prices and can also lead to tax evasion, which has another negative effect on the public finances. On the other hand, we find the paper of Lucas that mentions that larger governments tend to be beneficial for the economy because they harmonize social conflicts between the private sector and the community, and they can provide the basic needs and that are the goods and services that the community needs. Also, they mention that larger governments have a more stable legal system, a more stable administrative structure, a more stable economic infrastructure, which can offset market failures easier. These two works that I find, the Landau and Barro and also Lucas, they show a straight relationship between government size and economic growth, a linear relationship. However, there are works that find non-linear relationships between the size of the government and economic growth. For example, the work of Anneman mentions that small governments hinder economic growth mainly because of lack of capacity think about the lack of capacity to construct a road infrastructure. However, when you move from a small to a medium-sized government, you improve your fiscal framework, and which has positive implications for your economic development. Also, medium-sized governments increase their capacity in providing the basic goods and services. But once you surpass a certain threshold, you become a large government, and that can go hand in hand with excessive bureaucracy, which hinders economic development. Oh, wait, let me go back. Given all these different directions of the size of the government, the implication of the size of the government on economic growth, this triggers the question for me whether the size of the government for Curaçao and Sint Maarten in particular, how it affects the economic development in those two countries. So based on that, my main focus were actually the two countries in the monetary union of Curaçao and Sint Maarten. But as we all know, in 2010, these countries became autonomous in the Dutch kingdom. That means that, as we all know, Sint Maarten lacks a little bit of information in order to create a perfect data set. So unfortunately, I left Sint Maarten out, and then I focused mainly on Curaçao. But in order to create a bigger data set, I included 9 other Caribbean countries, which you can see here in the table on the presentation. And then I created a data set for the 20-year period starting in 2001 and ending in 2020. The data description shows, as you can see on the presentation, that all the indicators for the measure of the government and also the indicator for measuring the economic growth, they show wide spreads around their mean. You can notice at the minimum, the maximum, and then the spread between those two. For all the variables, it was quite high, and also the standard deviations of these variables were also high. They exceeded the 2%, the 2 threshold that indicates that 95% of all the data falls within that threshold. This means that the data needs some editing before we conduct econometric models. And also it means that it implies that there is no homogeneity of variances and no homogeneity of variances. After that, I constructed some scatter plots, but I did not present them. But the scatter plots showed that there was no relationship between my independent variable and my dependent variable. So this triggered me to conduct a correlation matrix that gave the same conclusion actually. The indicators will be explained in other slides, but actually the delta Y, the TGCE represents the total government current expenditure. The GC represents the government consumption, while the TGR is the government revenues, and TTR refers to the tax revenues. We see that they are not significantly linked to my dependent variable being the delta Y in the first column. But this triggers me, or this pushed me to conduct econometric model to really see if the relationship is not significant or can be significant. I constructed my first simple OLS, indicating that my dependent variable is the economic growth, denoted by the delta Y. I have a control variable that shows the initial level of GDP per capita of the countries. I construct the indicator for government size being the total government current expenditure. This is as a share of GDP to standardize it. I have 3 control variables which are chosen based on literature, which is the gross fixed capital formation, the population growth, and the inflation rate. Literature states that gross fixed capital formation is can be the sum of public and private investment. So higher public investment may crowd out private investment that could have gone into projects that has positive value to the economy and can increase the total factor productivity. Population growth is the findings of population growth is ambiguous. There are papers that show that population growth is positively linked to economic growth via an increased labor force, which has positive implications to the economic growth. And there are papers that find that a growth in the population puts a drag on the natural resources of a country, consequently leading to lower investment, which has negative implications on an economy. The inflation rate, which is my third control variable, has also two sides in literature. The first one implying that an increase in your annual inflation rate has a marginal negative effect on economic growth. However, the higher the initial level of the GDP, the more negative this effect becomes. And there is also literature that states the Tobin-Mundell hypothesis that states that if anticipated higher increase can lead to portfolio adjustments, which in turn lowers your real interest rate, which is positive for your investment, consequently has positive implications for your economy. I have the error term, which is denoted by the E, and then the I is the country, while the T represents the 20-year period. My second model includes, instead of taking the total government expenditures, it includes the government consumption. This is a disaggregated component of the government spending. When we do this, we net out every other spending that is obviously linked to the economic growth. Think, for example, about government transfers. All the other variables remain the same. I have to mention that the models, including the total revenues and the tax revenues, are not included neither in the paper or the presentation because I did not find any significant link between these variables. So they did not have any added value to the paper. My empirical results are as follows. You can see this is for the model, for my first model. You see panel A, B, C. I simply started putting the control variables gradually in. So actually you can take a look at model 1C, where you see that my Y, the first coefficient that you notice, that is the steady state level of the economy that is positively linked to your economic growth, meaning that the higher your steady state, the more your economy grows or the more positive it is. Also, I have the total government expenditure. That is my main indicator that I wanted to test. We notice a negative relationship between my main indicator and the economic growth, implying that a 1% growth in your total government expenditure has a 0.2 negative impact on your GDP growth. My control variable, gross fixed capital formation, is 0, so and it's insignificant and also 0, so it does not have any impact on your economy. My inflation rate is highly significant, however, it's close to 0, and my population growth is not even significant. So the inflation rate, we can see that it is a bit beneficial for the economy if you notice it in this model. However, it's that small that we can conclude that for these 10 countries that I included and during these years, price changes did not have any impact on your economy. My model 2 is the same as model 1. The only difference now is that the decomposed public spending, being the government consumption, has a higher coefficient. Now it's minus 0.33, meaning that government consumption has a more negative effect on your economic growth. Think about reasons. Reasons this might be is, for example, governments have fiscal policies that are not beneficial. They have overtaxation. They may have excessive bureaucracy, which hampers them to conduct their fiscal affairs properly. Also, when we notice the difference between model 2 and model 1, we notice that the R squared for model 2 is 0.33. It's a bit higher than model 1 being 0.25, meaning that actually government consumption captures more of the change in economic growth than the total government expenditures. After conducting my econometric models, I tested whether they were properly used. So I conducted the Durbin-Watson, which has a null hypothesis that says that residuals are uncorrelated, and I conducted the Jarque-Bera, which simply tests for the normality in the test. My Durbin-Watson gave me values between 1.7 to 1.9, which indicates that it falls between the threshold of 1.5 and 2.5 being threshold that are acceptable to accept the null hypothesis. Hence, my residuals were uncorrelated. And then I have my Jarque-Bera test, which state that my errors are normally distributed. Unfortunately, in this case, I failed the Jarque-Bera test, or my data set failed the Jarque-Bera test. However, it is only relevant, or it becomes only relevant if you have less than 100 observations. So below 100 observations, it nuanced it a bit. Now I come to the conclusion that state that I found a significant yet linear impact of government size on economic growth, both by government total current expenditure and government consumption. However, the impact of government consumption is more pronounced than that of total government current expenditure. I did not find no significant impact on my gross fixed capital formation, and neither on my population growth on economic growth. And I found significant impact of inflation on economic growth. However, its impact is close to zero. Now, for some policy recommendations, based on my conclusion and this analysis, I can say that governments should assess their spending behavior, adjust their current spending policies to long-run growth-oriented policies to enhance economic growth in a sustainable way, adjust their current fiscal policies to avoid fiscal deficits, since sustainable fiscal deficits can lead to macroeconomic instability, which is not good also for the economy. And also, I would like to say that my paper, as far as I know, is the first one including these Caribbean countries and including Curaçao that assesses the impact of economic growth of the government size on economic growth. And also it highlights the need of qualitative data, since for St. Maarten, this approach could not have been conducted. But we can fairly say, given the similarities, the economic similarities of Curaçao and St. Maarten being small open economies and also being net importers of goods and services, the same conclusion that I just provided here can be also taken for St. Maarten, but with caution. I would like to thank you for my presentation and state that clapping is still free.
Thank you, Raina. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, your discussant, Mr. Tijani, was not able to make it. He did, however, provide us with some questions, and if you'd like, I can read them out, and then maybe you can answer those questions that he kindly provided in his absence. So I'll start with the first question. He asked, would you expect public debt levels to affect this relationship?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Tijani. I expect the increase or the developments in the debt level to affect the total government spending, because their interest is one of the components of the government spending. Not exactly the debt level, but however the cost related to the debt can affect your outcome.
There's one more question, but maybe we can open it up to the floor for a little bit if someone wants to add some questions or comments on Raina's paper. No? Oh, there we go.
I was waiting for someone else to jump in, but thanks, Rainer. This is actually an area that I like. Just a couple comments, right? Firstly, in the Caribbean context, governments tend to be large because of the whole issue of private sector underdevelopment. So that's a known fact. One of the things I think you can do is look at computing fiscal multipliers, because what is important is the quality of the expenditure, right? So if you could compute the size of the fiscal multipliers for Curaçao, I think that would be beneficial, rather than taking the total government expenditure as a share of GDP.
Thank you. I'll take those into consideration.
Okay, and the second question from Mr. Tijani was, should emphasis shift from size to the composition and quality of spending? Very similar to what you pointed out.
I think it's relevant. It's a relevant question, and as my conclusion provide that the government consumption is more harmful to the economy, we can conclude actually that the quality of the spending on consumption does not provide any economic does not enhance the economy. So I think a lot better in changing the size. We can also check the pattern of spending and also the quality that you are spending if they provide value to the economy.
Okay, great. Any more questions? No? So you see, I'm not the only one that has had some research issues with Little St. Maarten. We have a ways to go with developing our deep statistical time series. So forgive us, festina lente, as the Romans used to say. We will hasten slowly to that day. Anything else? No? And then maybe we can wrap up. Thank you so much, Raina.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you for that very insightful presentation, and thank you for your questions.